This is Peter,
And this is Tom.
and you're listening to History Teachers Talking Podcasts. All right, this is Peter Zablocki and Thomas Reska, and welcome back to the podcast.
Hello, everybody.
All right, Tom. So since it's my job to set you up on this one, what is our topic today, Thomas?
Today we're going to be looking at the Red Scare. Well, the two Red Scares, the first Red Scare and the second Red Scare, and just basically what is a Red Scare, what happened during these two time periods in American history, and just how it's affected the country at that time. And it was massive hysteria and everything that goes with it.
Yeah, I guess kind of what we could learn from the events, but we should also mention that this was suggested to us by one of our listeners. So thank you. Let's kind of want to give us a little overview, Tom, about more or less what is the Red Scare?
Well, again, there's more than one, right? So a Red
Indeed.
Scare is basically it's the promotion of widespread fear, right, of a potential rise of communism or anarchism by a society or a state. And it usually refers to these two periods in American history. The first Red Scare, which occurred immediately after World War I, revolved around the perceived threat of the American labor movement. You had a lot of unions coming in, and we
Yeah.
saw what happened in Russia with the Bolshevik Revolution. So a lot of this political radicalism that was going on. The second Red Scare occurred really right after World War II. So you see this basically we win a war, but what's going on after the fact. We're kind of worried about what happened to other countries during this time. And again, the second Red Scare starts after World War II and was preoccupied with the perception that the nation or these foreign communists were infiltrating the government, right? And like spies, and they were trying to slowly turn the federal government into a communist state. And the
Yep.
reason it's called the Red Scare is because typically red flags are typically used by communists. So that's why it became known as the Red Scare.
I guess the plan for today is we'll kind of start off with more or less some comparisons between socialism, communism, anarchism, and capitalism, and kind of explain, I guess, more or less why Americans would be afraid. And you kind of mentioned this, but I guess we'll obviously elaborate on it. Why Americans would be afraid of communism, and then from there we'll jump into the first Red Scare in 1920, and then we'll hop over to the second one, and that hopefully should give a really good overview of these Red Scares.
Of
And
this time
oftentimes,
period, yeah.
yeah, time periods. And I think oftentimes when we think of the Red Scare when we are teaching it, people forget that there was two. Everyone
Yeah.
always kind of focuses on the McCarthy era, and they forget that this is something that originates during World War One, really.
Yeah, the first one. The first one was much. I think people were more afraid almost. A lot. You
Yeah,
can make that argument, or it led to a lot of some change. Like it led to the Sedition Act of 1918,
absolutely.
which we'll get to.
Communism versus socialism versus capitalism and anarchism. But the main difference between socialism and communism itself, right, is that socialism is more comparable and compatible with democracy and liberty, whereas communism involves creating an equal society, ultimately through an authoritarian state, and it basically denies any basic liberties, right? Um,
Well, the idea is everything's supposed. It's communal, right? That's what a
yes,
communist is supposed to be. And really, to become a communist society, you have to be a socialist society first.
yes. It's like
Kind of on that.
socialism is like a step towards
It's a
full
step
communism.
towards communism, which and really, there's never been a true. That's the thing. They always like, oh, we're afraid of communism, but there's never been a true communist country. And
No,
really,
yeah, not
there's
as
been
Marx.
yeah,
Yep,
not
go
as
ahead.
Marx describes it. So you have these communist communities maybe that last a while, and students always ask me, well, why do they always fail? And I always say, like, well, you like stuff, right? People like things. You like
Yeah.
having your Xboxes and your iPads and your Apple Watches and stuff like that. You don't have that in a communist society. It doesn't exist. It's not something that's considered valuable. But
Yeah.
you have these little societies. Kids, as generations go on, they might see these kids, somewhere else that has these newer technologies. They're going to want that, and then that's it. Human beings want things. That's why communism is very difficult for it to actually work. Socialism is a slightly different story.
And communism, we should mention, is it's a political system as much as it's economic. It's an economic
Yeah,
and political system, right? And
and
it's
a
all
way of
based
life, right? Yeah,
exactly, and it's all based on a single party government, right? It's mostly ruled by dictatorships, as you mentioned, and the idea here is that this government's supposed to equalize wealth and power in a nation. Communists, think of the root word of communism is community, really. People rule. Again, that's why we said, and as you mentioned, it's never really existed per se because it always turns into a dictatorship. But it's the ability of people to kind of take over and rule themselves, right? And in order to equalize this wealth and power, right, communists would technically put an end to all private property, basically government ownership of factories, railroads, businesses. the government would ensure that we are looking at an fair society. Prices are set by the government. There's an equality of income, so wages are set by the government. Completely authoritarian state. Now versus socialism, it's kind of like a. It's not really based on revolution. It's there's still democracy involved. It's kind of like a mix of public and private sector. So there is some individual liberty versus an authoritarian state, like
Theoretically,
communism,
yeah. And it's more
right?
like this. I used to say like basically this in a like a capitalist society, people control like private people control the means of production. In a socialist society, the state controls the means of production. In a communist society, ideally, it's supposed to be all the people control the means of production.
Yep.
It just doesn't always ideally work that way.
Yeah, and the way Lenin kind of did this with Soviet Union, his first Bolshevik revolution, he wanted the Soviet government that would basically be ruled by directly be ruled by councils that were made up of soldiers, peasants, workers. That was his way of like bringing these councils together. That way, people are directly ruling. But obviously, he would oversee all that. So there's also anarchy, which is, I guess, complete distrust of government. Ultimately,
And it's like no government whatsoever, right?
yep.
It's just
Um,
yeah.
and then you have, good old capitalism, which is our system of, it's our economic system of competition. The idea that you could get ahead by doing something, by not being limited by the government, by not necessarily being
There's
socialism.
some government oversight, and again,
Exactly.
that wasn't always the case. That would be like that starts with, well, you have some of it, but obviously the
Yeah.
New Deal's a lot of examples of that, right? Future podcast,
Yeah. Future
but
podcast.
you
Ha.
have all
We
those.
got it out.
Actually, I was reading all of the research for this. There's a lot of future podcasts that were going over some of these things, like the Bolshevik Revolution and
Yep. Oh, there's a
Lenin.
lot
We
of
could
good stuff.
just do Lenin.
I read a book on Lenin. It was actually really good. It's called The Lenin Plot, and it was how the United States tried to assassinate Lenin. It was a very interesting book. So the Russian Revolution, there's two of them. A lot of people don't know that. The first one fails. And ultimately, that is repeated again. And you have the second one, which is a little bit more successful.
Because remember, Lenin gets kicked out, and then doesn't the Germans help him? They sneak him back in
They do.
because World War II is going on. World War I is going on.
Yep. So essentially, why there's a fear here is that this revolution, basically between 1890 and 1910, the population of major Russian cities uh, doubles. Right, it results with overcrowding, destitute living conditions. I mean, it's essentially
Mm,
terrible for the common man in
Yeah,
Russia.
it's
And
horrible.
it's horrible. So now you have these large protests start off in 1905 of Russian workers. This starts from, and this is important for later on what we're going to talk about, because these large protests start by Russian workers in the labor unions, really, and it's against the monarchy. And this leads to this bloody Sunday massacre in 1905. Hundreds of unarmed protesters are killed and wounded by the Tsar's troops, and this is a failed revolution. These guys are trying to ultimately take over the government, but they're doing this through workers unions, what I mean, like Russian workers. And this plays a really important part for us in our podcast today. But they succeed in doing this second time around, the February Revolution, February 1918, right? I think it's 1918.
Yeah.
Same premise. You have these demonstrators, they're clamoring for bread, they take to the streets. And as you mentioned, Tom, Lenin is actually brought in to Russia. Like he's smuggled into Russia because he was exiled after the first failed one, and he's brought in by the Germans because the Germans want Russia to get out of the war,
Yeah, they Lenin basically said, put me in power, help me get power.
and
I
I will
will and
overthrow this government.
I will overthrow the Tsarist government, and I will make peace with Germany. And
Yep,
Germany wants that because then they don't have to worry about the Eastern Front anymore.
yep. And so he is successful in his Bolshevik revolution. Bolshevik actually means the majority, to be specific, and eventually the Bolshevik change
The
their
Bolsheviks.
moniker to communism. I mean, so Bolshevik, being Bolshevik, you become a communist, and why is that important, right, Tom? So why is it important that this originates or stems from labor?
Because it's the idea of these
Disgruntled,
workers,
I
right,
guess, right? Yeah.
rising up, disgruntled workers rising up. You're having this in the United States at this time too, after World War I,
Yep.
during World War I, but mostly after World War I, because a lot of the workers were they kind of agreed we're not going to go on strike, we're not going to ask
Hmm.
for increased wages and stuff like that during the war,
Yep.
because it's huge nationalism. Let's support the war effort, patriotism. Let's win this war first. Now the war's over, and they're like, all right, so we did what we told you we can do during the war. Now it's time for you to do what you told us you were going to do, which is give us better conditions, better hours, more pay.
Yep.
And a lot of the factory owners and a lot of these owners like, we're not doing that. And then so these that's really the beginning of a lot of the workers, steel workers, iron workers, coal workers. They start to unionize,
Yep.
and unionizing back then was a fear of, okay, well, if they're going to unionize, that's going to rise up and it's going to be a Bolshevik type revolution here in the United States. And we didn't really get into it that much. And it's not purpose of this podcast, but the Bolshevik Revolution was a bloody revolution. It was not like kind of just overthrow and that's it. It was a bloody mess
Yep.
where people being killed, children being killed, right? Anastasia, all that stuff with the
Yep.
Romanov dynasty.
Oh, that's a
So
good podcast.
there's a lot there, a lot of
Um,
violence.
A lot of violence. And because what you're seeing here is you're seeing the labor force unionizing and essentially striking, as well as, I would say, just kind of going out in numbers. This is very reminiscent to what
Protests. Yeah.
happened in Russia, which is why it kind of freaks people out. And also, during World War One, Americans kind of became very xenophobic. They become kind of afraid of foreigners, and there's a huge nativist feeling or prejudice against like foreign-born people, and this stemmed really during the war against Germans, Hungarians, and
The Huns. Yeah.
the Huns. Right? That's ultimately you would have Liberty cabbage as opposed to sauerkraut. I mean, that's the extent it got to. So all these nativist fears and xenophobia that was kind of directed against the quote unquote bad guys of World War One is now shifted over to like, wait a second, like the Russians were kind of radicals and the labor overthrew a whole government. Like, hold on a second. So this becomes a really a fear, a genuine fear, which is only further compounded in January of 1919 in Seattle. Did you read about that one?
Is that
So,
the go ahead.
shipyard. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in 1919, 35,000 shipyard workers in Seattle go on strike, right? And they want wage increases, they want better hours. But what essentially happens here, which kind of freaks the nation out, is so they appeal to the Seattle Central Labor Council for support, right? And also to other unions. And all of a sudden they find a lot of like a widespread enthusiasm towards this. I mean, other
Yeah, and
unions
pretty
are
much
like
all of Seattle goes on strike with
literally
this,
all
right?
Seattle, 60,000 total
Yeah.
strikers.
The
Um,
Seattle General Strike. Yeah.
Exactly. It paralyzed the entire city. So, streetcar service, schools, ordinary commerce. I mean, it literally shut down Seattle. And because of the numbers, the 60,000 people that workers from various positions that just went on strike, the media basically freaked out. And it is this idea of the Red Scare stems from the media. It's like, wait, hold on a second. Like, where's this going? This is going towards a revolution? Is it not? And that's also when you start looking at the fact that a lot of these labor unions were becoming kind of infiltrated by a lot of socialists, right?
Yeah, well, there was a
Anarchists.
huge well that there was just a lot of immigration coming from Southern and
Absolutely.
Eastern Europe after World War One. So they're coming into the country and they're bringing a lot of those ideas with them. And some of them are communist, absolutely. Some aren't, but
Yeah.
either. But but that's just like you said before, that xenophobia against all of these people come in, that nativism starts to take over, right?
There is this fear, especially, and this is again played out by the media, that the communists or the Reds, because they use their symbolic red flag, there's ultimately going to be a worldwide revolution that would abolish capitalism everywhere, and this is kind of being played up a lot in American newspapers.
Well, it's
Which,
also what the communists. I'm sorry to talk over. It's
yeah, go
also
go
what
go,
the communists are talking about, right? In Lenin's
yep,
book, one of Marx's book, they talk, said, that there has to be this bloody revolution. That those in power, right, the
yep,
bourgeoisie aren't going to give it up, and that the proletariat has to rise up and basically kill them all. And
yep,
that's how they're going to get the power.
yep,
So you're hearing this, and that's the media is definitely talking about, like you're saying, Pete. People are going to get freaked out. They just
yep,
fought a war. They have these one set of ideals, and now they're seeing all this labor strife and protests and stuff like that. It's mirroring what happened in Russia. So they are they're worried that it
yep,
could happen here. They think it actually could happen here.
yep. And as you mentioned, I mean, most of the working people are a lot of them are immigrants, and that's also why the xenophobia aspects, like, well, what are these guys planning? And a communist party actually forms in the United States around this time, and there is a claim that about 70,000 radicals ultimately joined some of the different unions across the nation. One of the bigger ones being the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW. While there's this feeling of, okay, why are all these unions and labor strikes going on? Why is everyone complaining? Why are they all rising up? While this is happening, all of a sudden you have these dozens, right, of bombs are mailed to government and business leaders across the nation. These bombs are sent over to essentially really known business leaders and
Yeah,
government,
yeah.
right? And this is where
Government buildings, yeah, business leaders, yeah,
absolutely. And the one
political
that
leaders.
really becomes important, Tom, right? Which one is really the one that kind of sets this
Well,
time period?
they said a Richard Palmer, right? They
Yes.
put a bomb outside of his house, but I believe the guy himself got killed in the blast. Like
Yeah,
the
so
bomber himself
he blew his face off.
yeah,
Yep.
he didn't get away in time, right?
Yep. So U.S. Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer is already trying to like eradicate, what many Americans see as a real threat. Like he's already going after these communists that he thinks are infiltrating these unions and causing these bad ideas. And then, as you said, Tom, someone tries to blow up his house where his family's in there, and they accidentally blow themselves up, and the house is
Yeah,
destroyed.
and
But
Palmer takes this personally.
very much, his family was in a
Yeah,
house, and they survived. But that's all right. So what does Palmer do?
he's going to go around what becomes known as the Palmer raids and basically doing illegal searches, seizures, unwarranted arrests, and he's rounding these people up that he believes are radicals, that they believe are radicals, and they're basically rounding them up and getting ready to deport them. They had no
Yep.
real due process. Really, a lot of it's hearsay.
Yep.
You don't like your neighbor, or my neighbor's a communist. It's almost
Yep.
like the Salem witch trials, right? And then
Yep.
that's
Yep.
what it's often compared to, these red scares. And that's what you want to do. You want to get back at someone, you just call these phone numbers. You just call the police,
Yep.
whatever, and tell them the guy down the street's a communist. I've seen him, talking about it. He has a hammer and a sickle, right? He's wearing a lot of red. He's a
Yep.
commie. He's a red. And then the Palmer and his men are going to come and pick him up.
There was no due process. They would show up at someone's house and someone would speak to them in an accent. They're like, "Yep, good enough." Boom. They would
Yeah,
just deport
you're a
them like
radical.
that
Yep.
day. We also should mention that Palmer, being the attorney general, he appoints a really young Edgar Hoover,
Sugar Hoover. Yeah.
who like that should be a podcast, who like rules over the FBI and said basically begins the idea of an FBI here. And it is J. Edgar Hoover that is like a right hand man or the extension of Mitchell Palmer, and they're the ones hunting all these different communists. But eventually, this gets extremely out of hand, and people believe that Palmer was really doing that because he was kind of looking for some form of a campaign issue to gain some support for his presidential aspirations. But that never came to fruition because the public eventually decided that Palmer just didn't really know what he was talking about. And, newspapers started to turn against him, which ultimately leads to the end of Palmer raids, which you might
Yeah.
say kind of
Well,
slowly
the big
brings
thing
the
was,
end to
yeah,
this
before
first
the
Red
Red
Scare.
Scare, it was
Yep.
basically him, and then Hoover's also kept on talking about May Day, right? He kept on saying that
Yes.
in May
Big
Day
deal.
of 1920, there was going to be this huge uprising, and everyone get ready. There's going to be this huge uprising on May Day, and it came and passed, and nothing happened.
Yeah.
And then that's when you started seeing the public opinion. But the big thing was in the courts. A lot of the courts started ruling against Palmer also. And that pretty much put an end to his raids. And when the Palmer raids stopped, like you said, the first Red Scare pretty much fades
Yep.
away. Doesn't say some of those ideas are still there. The Americans are not suddenly in love with communism and
Yep.
the idea of communism or even immigrants, but it's just kind of like, all right, there's not going to be a revolution. There's some of these people here that have these ideas, but there's people that have all types of ideas. So be it. And they're just moving on to the next thing.
So Palmer basically ends, and as you said, this more or less ends the first Red Scare. But one thing before we move on that I wanted to kind of touch upon is that it is during this time where the idea of being a communist or being an anarchist or socialist gets thrown around by Palmer at African Americans. Like race is brought into this.
Hmm.
And this is also brought in, like, as African Americans are agitators and labor unions and so on and so forth. And this idea is brought in, and it kind of, you could say that Hoover sticks with this. I mean, Hoover eventually calls, in the 50s and 60s, he calls Martin Luther King the biggest communist. I mean, so Hoover's idea
Yeah.
of tying communism, anarchism, and all these things to African Americans begins here in 1919.
It's
So,
also a way of, again, to politically destroy someone or to discredit someone is you just call them a communist. It
yep,
doesn't have to be true, but you're
yep.
saying that. And the tone, the idea of a communist is so negative in the United States at that time that by just calling someone a communist, that was enough.
Yep. Let's kind of fast forward. As you said, it's not like communism is not a thing. Because let's put it this way: by the height of World War II, so we're looking, like let's say, I think it was like 1944. There was about 80,000 Americans that claimed membership in the Communist Party. Communism is a real thing in the United States, and 80,000 people is a lot of people. And also, we should mention that during World War II, at this time we are technically friends with the Soviet Union. I mean, at least for the latter part of the
Right.
war.
So like
After
you're right. The enemy of my enemy is my friend.
exactly,
That's basically the mindset. So they were considered the lesser of two evils.
yeah, right, to say the
He's
least.
calling Stalin lesser of two evils, but still, that's something
But
else
then,
to be discussed.
right? So now World War II ends, Cold War starts, and this early Cold War kind of has a lot of Americans believe that there is actually some decent reason to be concerned about the security of the United States, right?
Oh yeah, well,
Um,
those fears weren't unfounded. The
yeah,
Soviet
absolutely.
Union, for a long time, was carrying out espionage spy activities inside of the United States with the aid of U.S. citizens. Even during World War II, this was
Hmm.
going on. So that apprehension about the Soviet Union grew as the Cold War heated up. It kind of made sense. I mean, it was happening. Yeah,
Yep. So
on a
the
certain level.
yeah, absolutely. And actually, a lot of the documents were released in the 90s after Soviet Union fell. And we just, at that point, we really discovered the scope of how many spies were actually in the
Oh yeah,
United
yeah.
States during like the years directly after World War II and during World War II. They're just trying to get our military secrets. They're trying to somehow be a step ahead of us.
And they
And
succeed
and they
in
do
some
succeed. I mean,
aspects.
think of the atomic weapon. So
Yeah.
there's also the communist takeover of China, which shocks the American public. Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. There's actually fear that communism might spread around the world, and communism is not in any way, shape, or form compatible with American idea of capitalism. Like Americans love to, work and make money and ultimately make a better life for themselves, where we distinguish ourselves by the things that we own. Like we kind of view money as a sign of respect. Like if someone is wealthy, we see that as that person, it made it. We have
Mhm.
respect towards that. And if you bring in communism, it basically shatters the entire ideology that the United States is based off of. You know what I mean? There's no more competition. There's no more you drive a Porsche versus you drive a Chevy. It's just a car, and like it's so
Yeah, and there's
un-American
no
to think about.
that's how yeah, that's what I always told the students also, is it wasn't like just look around the room or look how many people wearing different types of clothes, different types of jeans. You have different choice. You
Yeah.
don't have that choice in a true communist society. Like we're saying, you might have cars, you'll have that technology, but it's going to be one type of car, and
Yeah.
that's just a car. You're going to have clothes, but it's going to be the clothes that are made. It's not going to be clothes, let's say, for like leisure, or clothes that are going to necessarily be made to be comfortable. It's just going to be here are
Close.
clothes.
And honestly,
That's it.
I could totally attest to that because I grew up in communist country. There's no question about it. Granted, when I was growing up in Poland in the 80s, communism was on its way out, but it was still very much entrenched in communism. And I'm telling you, everyone had a Fiat. A Fiat, which is obviously an Italian company, was brought into Poland, and there was a factory that made Fiats. So almost like 90% of people had a Fiat, and it only came in certain colors. And the clothes we wore were all very similar. Like everything really was like there was no chains, there was no McDonald's. I mean, when the first McDonald's opened up in Russia, I mean,
It was
you could
days
YouTube
wait. You had
this.
to wait for days. Yeah.
Yeah, you could YouTube this. People waited for days online.
And all it
Like they
was
got
a Big Mac. I think all they sold
that's all
was
it
Big
was.
Mac,
Yeah,
Coke, and fry. But
because
they
there's
heard of it, and
choices though. But there's
yeah,
choices,
yeah.
which is crazy because there's
Well,
the
it's
idea that
definitely yeah. I mean, it's
uh,
crazy for people who've always had that choice, right? Who've always
absolutely.
had those things. But like you said, that paranoia was very real. To get back to that,
Yeah, so
like
you want to hit
Truman.
up like Truman loyalty boards, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, Executive Order 9835, right? Also
Yep.
known as a loyalty order, which basically mandated that all federal employees had to be analyzed. So they had like a background check, and they
Hmm.
had to determine whether they would be loyal to the government. And if they was determined they would not be loyal to the government, they wouldn't have their job. They would be further investigated. They wouldn't
Yep.
necessarily be thrown in jail, but they'd be basically blacklisted.
Yep. And this is where the FBI really gets involved. In 1947, under
Yeah,
this
spying on
executive
everybody,
order, they just spy on everyone. Yeah, I mean, it was like it was the
and they
enforcement
did it for
agency.
years. They did it forever.
Years. I mean, extensive background checks. All federal
Yeah,
employees, applicants for federal jobs. I mean, they were looking for anyone basically that potentially had anything to do with communism or knew someone that had communist ties. From 1947 to 1951, the government loyalty boards investigated 3.2 million employees. And actually, if you think about it, they only dismissed about 212 as security risks. Um, but another like 3,000 people resigned because they did not want to be investigated or felt that the investigation like violated their constitutional rights.
yeah. They're just like that's enough. It's not worth it. I'll
Yeah,
go work in the private sector. I'll do something
exactly.
different.
which is nuts. And then you have, so after this loyalty review board, which is kind of the first step by Truman in 47 to be like, all right, we got to like figure out how many communists are here. Then you have the House of Un-American Activities Committee.
Yeah, which took
And
place in the House of Representatives, right?
yes, yep. So it's this new agency basically that is also investigating possible communist influence, right? But this one is both inside and outside of the United States government. Um,
Yeah. The
so
biggest one was that they were dealing with the Hollywood film industry,
absolutely,
right? Yeah.
it was
Go ahead.
huge. Okay, so what happened there, Tom?
Well, they put this committee together, and they're searching. They're going through all these Hollywood actors,
Yep.
and it was under pressure from the negative publicity aimed at their studios. So a lot of movie executives created what's called the Hollywood blacklist that basically barred a lot of these suspected radicals
Hmm.
from employment. If they were in movies, they were not going to be in movies, after that. And a lot of these similar lists that happen in Hollywood with these blacklists happen in other industries as well, like all
Yep.
around the country. So these are the people that we think are communists or have communist ties or may have said something about negative about the U.S. government, and it just goes from there.
Yep. We should mention that this is kind of ridiculous because what they're saying is HUAC is obviously the acronym for House Un-American Activities Committee, but what they were saying is that there's such a huge communist influence in movie industry. They believe that communists were sneaking propaganda into film, and they would point to these different pro-Soviet movies that were actually made during World War II because we were friends with the Soviets. But it's like, no, that's no good.
It would make sense at that time, yeah.
I mean, think about, remember World War One, when they said that any movie that was made against the British or made the British look bad and they were allies was bad, according to the Sedition Acts. So there was actually a case in U.S. Supreme Court. The movie that came out during World War One, I'm a little off topic, but it pertains, was The Spirit of 1776. It was a movie about the United States American Revolutionary War against the British. So obviously, the British, the Redcoats, were the bad guys. So anyway, the filmmakers of that movie during World War One, obviously they made the British seem bad because Revolutionary War. They were like thrown in jail for that. So the
Yeah,
case went to the
during World
Supreme
War One, you
Court,
do that.
and this is crazy. The case was called U.S. versus the Spirit of 1776. Talk about the irony in that. Crazy. Eventually, it was dismissed. Like, yeah, that's unconstitutional. Like these people, it's okay to make that movie. But that's kind of where we're at here. And as you said, Hollywood executives kind of create their own blacklist. They're like, all right, we don't want the government getting in here. We'll take
That's
care of this
basically what it is,
ourselves.
though. Yeah, they don't want the government getting involved. So they're like the government kind of said, all right, we won't get involved, but then you have to kind of police your own. So they create their own blacklist. It's kind of
Absolutely.
they turn on people just to basically save their own skin because they don't want the government coming and finding other things going on.
Absolutely. So there's also the McCarran Act. Essentially, as Hollywood tries to rid itself of communists, Congress decides that Truman's Loyalty Review Board just does not go far enough, like in protecting national
Uh,
security.
yes, I've
So in
heard this.
1950, they passed this I think it's McCarran Internal Securities Act, something, or Security Act. It requires all communist organizations in the United States to register with the federal government. So now, like, if you are communist, we need you on file, right? It also made it unlawful to plan any action that might lead to an establishment of a totalitarian dictatorship in the United States. Um, and immigrants suspected of promoting communism, or immigrants that are coming from Eastern Europe or Russia, well, essentially barred from entering the country, and or departed. So Truman thinks that this is kind of like not okay. So he vetoes this bill. He says, and this is a quote from Truman: "In a free country, we punish men for the crimes they commit, but never for the opinions they have." Because he's saying basically, if you believe in anything that's semi quasi socialist or communist, like you should be deported. Um, and Truman's like, no, that's not how things should be. But anyway, Congress um, actually overrules his veto and it enacts the law, which is kind of crazy. And then, Tom,
Very
did you hear
crazy.
about the? Sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm saying it's very crazy. Yeah, because you're supposed to be able to believe what you want.
Exactly. That's
That's the
that's the
whole.
American way.
That's the whole basis. Yeah.
It's nuts. Did you read about the Venona project?
I did see about the Venona project, but that comes much later on, right?
Yeah,
That's in
it's
1995, 1995.
yeah, exactly. So this it's originates in 43 and it is 95. Absolutely. This is cool though. In 1943, the US Army Signal Intelligence Service, right? Begins the Venona project. And basically the organization, the US Army Signal Intelligence Service, is the precursor or predecessor to what becomes known as the National Security Agency or the NSA. So the project's goal was to decode any messages that were sent by Soviet intelligence agencies. And you had like thousands of analysts, and they basically decoded enough to learn that Soviet spies had infiltrated essentially all levels of US government. Like we knew this in the 40s.
Yeah, we knew that they were in the Manhattan Project.
Exactly. That's how we figured all that out. So
Yeah.
3,000, as you said, 95, 3,000 decoded messages that made up this entire Venona papers were declassified in 1995. And it confirmed for a fact that 349 US residents had secret relationships with Soviet Union. And therefore, that the suspicions that HUAC, as well as the McCarran Act had, like about, communist spies in the US, were not necessarily unfounded. Like, something else happens. Obviously, in 1949 is when the United States learned that the Soviet Union has exploded the atomic bomb. In 1950,
Nuclear
German
monopoly is over. Yep.
exactly. In 1950, German-born physicist Klaus Fuchs admits that he gave Soviet Union information about this atomic bomb. And while he admits that, in his questioning, names come up of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, who were essentially like minor activists in the American Communist Party, but they were implicated enough in this Fuchs case. So, who are Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, Tom?
Well, they're basically an American civilians that were
Yep.
convicted of spying on behalf of the Soviet Union, and they were accused of providing top secret information on like jet propulsion, radar, sonar engines. But the biggest was the nuclear weapons designs, and this was during the time like prior to the Soviets detonating their first atomic bombs. They were actually convicted of spying in 1951 and later executed by the government in 53.
Yeah.
And they were the first American civilians to be executed for such crimes during peacetime.
Yes. And that's what
And
freaked people out. But that was the whole point. The
yeah,
point was to freak people out.
they want to say this is not going to be tolerated.
Exactly.
And for decades, there was a lot of argument of saying, no, 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 they didn't do it. They didn't do it. They're victims of Cold War propaganda until those Verona papers came out, and it pretty much proved that
They did.
no, Julius was basically he was a like a courier and tried to recruit other people for the Soviets, and
Yeah.
that Ethel was more. She maybe not as much as him, but she was basically
She knew about it.
helped. She knew
Yeah.
about it. She was an accessory, and she actually helped recruit her brother David into the spy ring as well. You see, and she worked as a secretary, typing up documents that her husband would give to the Soviets. And a lot of this was all finally declassified in 1995, but even more was declassified in 2008 when the National Archives published the grand jury testimony related to the prosecution. So
Really? I
I
didn't know
mean,
that. That's cool.
they Julius was definitely guilty, and Ethel was definitely a accessory to the murder to the crime to the
Wow.
espionage. So whether they should have been killed or not, that's one of those debates people can have. But they were definitely, for the most part, were involved with what was that they were being charged with.
And I actually think that, the reason that they were killed was to show that, it doesn't matter if you're an older lady or, a middle aged man. It doesn't matter. Like,
Well, yeah,
we
if
will
you look like
kill
them, they look
you.
like the most. Yeah, they look like your next door neighbor. So it
Exactly.
also it, so it also freaked people out. Like, oh my god, my neighbor really could be communist. If Julius and Ethel are communist,
And remember
who
when we
else
were
could be
younger, you
communist?
would see those neighborhood watch signs all over the neighborhoods?
Hmm.
Like, those stem from this time period.
Yeah,
1950s, when
same.
you would see
Yeah.
these neighborhood watch signs, like there's neighborhood watch, like we're gonna pay attention to what you're doing, so be careful. Like, Judy didn't bring out her recycling; she doesn't recycle. That's un-American. Like, boom, you would be reported to like HUAC. Like this is the kind of life that people led during this time, which is crazy. But yeah, they died in electric chair, as you mentioned. Even though the case was appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, the court's like, yeah, no, not going to happen. And as you said, now that we know from all these papers, rightfully so, regardless of whether the penalty itself was the right one, but at least they were indeed found guilty. And then you might say, like, poop hits the fan with a Republican from Wisconsin, Senator Joseph McCarthy. And that's when,
McCarthy.
like,
Yes, this is
this was basically like the Palmer version, like the
yeah.
1950s Palmer,
Yeah,
right?
when that old saying that history repeats itself. I mean, you really see it here. I mean,
Yeah.
look at you have a war after a war. What happens? Okay,
Yep.
we start to have these feelings that Russia is changing or becoming more powerful in both of these scenarios, right? After
Yep.
World War One, after World War Two, and you're seeing a lot of anti-immigrant feelings, and then you're having this fear of communist takeover, and you have a loudmouth that comes in and tries to basically use it to their own advantage for their own political gains.
Yeah. So just a quick thing on Joseph McCarthy before you get into like what he did. Um, so he was in a senate. He was a senator from Wisconsin for 3 years, but he kind of gained a reputation as a dud. Right? They said like he is such an ineffective legislator, and he knew that he was not going to win the January 1950 election. Like it wasn't going to happen. So he needed some kind of an issue that could get him reelected. I'm sorry, in 1952, and he kind of starts this in 1950. So he looks for that issue, and he kind of decides that, you know what, I have an issue. I'm going to basically say that know for a fact that there's communists that are taking over the government, and that's kind of when this whole thing starts.
Well, yeah, he stirs up this fear in the United States that the communists will infiltrate the government, and he said he has a list,
Yeah,
right? That there's at least 81 separate cases, but even more than that,
yeah. The
of
list keeps on growing. It starts 57,
yeah,
then the next day he's like 81, and then like a week later he's like
yeah. So
205
he's saying he has
communists.
this, and these are suspected. These are communists. Like he's saying, guaranteed. This is a list of names, even though he never showed anybody
Never
this
enough.
list of names. So he provided little or no evidence, but it did prompt the Senate to call a full investigation hearing, and that's when he starts to call these people to it. When he's those famous lines you can see him on YouTube, on TV. Have you now ever been a member of the Communist Party? And he's just basically doing this to advance his own political career.
Yeah. And this becomes known as McCarthyism. It's the 1950s,
Yes.
and the McCarthyism actually refers specifically now to an unfair tactic of accusing people of disloyalty without proving any evidence. Like this guy's
He
name now took on this
took over,
definition.
yeah. And he's just calling people out. If he doesn't like you, you're a communist.
Yep, just accusation after accusation after accusation.
And then
Absolutely.
people got afraid to call him out on it for the most part, at least early on, because they didn't want to be labeled a communist. That would be
Hmm.
the end of them, politically, or at least, people are going to look at him a little bit differently. You just call someone a communist back then, back during this age of McCarthyism, that's a death sentence for your career anyway.
Absolutely. And there was no like you no longer needed proof of any Communist
No.
Party connection. Like that wasn't
Nope.
required. As long as someone's like
What?
you're a communist, and then FBI would literally start an investigation against you. I mean, they compiled lists of like millions, right, of people just questionable with any form of questionable political views. And these guys started spreading to different branches of government, universities, labor unions, private businesses. Essentially, Americans feared that if they did not take actions against the listed individuals, like, oh, I think this guy's communist, but what if I don't say anything, like they might themselves be labeled soft on communism. So now, before you know it, people are like, Judy didn't take out, the trash the other day. I'll call somebody, So thousands of Americans, essentially, as you mentioned, lose their jobs for political reasons. Like
Yeah.
this,
Yeah,
and nothing
absolutely. And it
stops this
changes.
guy.
No, nothing
Nothing.
stops. And it changes how the Americans, like the temperament of American society too. They're just like afraid of communist espionage. There is films like My Son John, which is about like parents' suspicion that their son is a spy. Right? It's just like a movie like you have to think your
Yeah,
son could be a spy. Who even knows it? Like the Cincinnati Reds, that's a baseball team in case you didn't
I
know,
know
Peter.
what that
Um,
is.
they actually temporarily changed their names to the Cincinnati Redlegs because they wanted to avoid, losing money and career ruining um, baseball player, ruining the baseball player's career because they were called the Reds, the communists. So they actually
Right?
changed their name for a number of years to the Redlegs. Just to
That's
it's
nuts.
crazy.
Well, think of it this way, like to kind of go with this idea of like fear of communism having no limits. I read somewhere that in Indiana, professional wrestlers had to take the loyalty oath. Like to be a professional wrestler, you had to take a loyalty oath. And then there was different experiments that were ran by newspapers. In the 1950s where these newspaper journalists would start walking up to pedestrians on the street and they basically had quotes of the Declaration of Independence, and they would ask pedestrians on the street to sign these petitions that quoted the Declaration of Independence, and no one would sign them because they were afraid that the ideas that were written on there were communist. Like it was quotes from the Declaration of Independence. Like that's insane, you know.
That's
So
upsetting.
how does McCarthy end? What happens here?
Well, basically, he keeps on going around accusing people until he goes after the army.
Yep.
And that was basically his downfall because he goes after the army at the Army McCarthy hearings, and the army lawyer Joseph Wench famously calls him, famously says him, have you no decency? And then after that, a lot of the colleagues they kind of start to denounce him in 1954, and they're saying, yeah, he's because they keep on saying, show us a list, and he's not showing them anything. So they kind of he's losing his steam. People realize that he's all talk, that the communists have not infiltrated the government to the level that he says, that there's
Yep.
no communist uprising about to happen. Very similar to what happens in the first Red Scare, right? When May Day comes and goes and nothing happens, everyone gets fevered up, right? This is it, this is it, this is it. And then nothing happens and it just kind of fades away. He loses credibility. And when he loses credibility, the ideas of the Red Scare don't go away. I wouldn't say the Red Scare ended, but McCarthyism ends in 1954.
Yeah, and then 3
Red
years
Scare
later,
stays on.
he suffers from he basically becomes an alcoholic.
Oh, yeah.
and then 3 years later he dies, and that kind of ends this whole idea of like McCarthy's downfall. But so what happens? I mean, I would say that more or less after McCarthyism, people kind of realize like, I mean, obviously you have this idea of there's a fear of an H bomb, there's an arms race now, people are building bunkers, and all that stems from, I wouldn't say directly Red Scare of communism within the country. This is more of Red Scare in the sense of you're afraid of communists outside the country that are going to like bomb us. But I would say that McCarthyism kind of, wouldn't you say that kind of brings Red Scare to more or less to,
Well, it doesn't. I don't. It gets rid of the fear that there's going to be a communist uprising in the U.S. I wouldn't
yeah,
say it gets rid of a fear of communism.
yep,
You might say it kind of shifts more to fear of the Soviet Union.
yep,
But still, if you're calling someone a communist at this point, it's still like a bad. You call someone a communist now. I don't know if it holds the same weight as if you called someone a communist back in the 50s or 60s or even 70s.
right?
You know.
Well, that's my question. Like, I mean, communism technically, right? I mean, in the United States, I mean, it's kind of funny because I don't think it's as big of a deal, obviously, as it was in the 50s, ever
Well, but
since
you
the
look
Cold War
politically
ended.
though, like when politicians call each other a communist, oh, these are communist activities. They want to make things communist. It still has some weight. I wouldn't say it has no weight, but it definitely doesn't have what it did 50 years ago.
Yeah.
But the trend, it really did. Like you had a lot of these rulings, and it did impact the United States. You
No.
calling someone a communist even today is still, they might get a couple extra looks from like law enforcement. I can see that definitely still happens. They're still going to be politically, a candidate who's a communist doesn't really have much of a chance of winning anything.
Yeah. Well, actually, the last time a communist party ran for presidential in the presidential election was in 1984. Gus Hall was their presidential nominee
Yeah, so
from
they
the
have no
American
political
Communist
power
Party.
really.
I mean, and right now, I mean, it's still a thing. I mean, there's still a communist party in the United States.
Yeah, but what it also shows is that basically, I guess we didn't touch on it that much, but like a lot of the censorship that happens, and it's an example of how these unfounded fears can compromise like the civil liberties that we hold so dear to ourselves. You have these fears of this uprising, so we need to keep the public safety, so we have to sacrifice our individual liberty to keep public safety. It's always that balance between the two, you know?
Yeah, kind of like I kind of bring that up when I talk to my students. When we talk about the Patriot Act, it's the same thing.
Yeah,
Like what price are you willing to pay for perceived
for your
feeling of safety?
safety. How much of your freedom are you willing to give up for that? And
Yeah,
that's a fine line.
yeah. So I think this I mean that's not bad, man. We did this in like record time over here. This is good stuff. I would say this pretty much covers our Red Scares,
Yeah, the
right?
basic ideas and the basic premises.
Yeah, and I think that's what our podcast is about. It's the basic ideas and basic
It's all about.
premises. All
That's it.
right, we got this. So, as always, everyone, thank you so much for tuning in every week and listening to us. It really is awesome that you guys keep on coming back, which means we're doing semi okay here. And as always, you could find us on social media. You could always find us at historyteacherstalkingpodcast.com. And as like this episode, which is suggested actually by a parent of my former student. So please feel free to make some suggestions, and we will most definitely look into those things for you guys. So I think that
Absolutely.
concludes our podcast.
Stay safe, everybody.
I hope everyone enjoyed our podcast, and if you would like to email us, you can do so at historyteacherspodcast@gmail.com.